forward, we're almost, I guess, to the halfway point, close. Now that spring has arrived and we can do that. So, and tonight we look at another facet of the gospel that's raised by sort of our progress through the various chapters of the text. We come to chapter 11 in our sort of journey through Matthew, and that raises the topic of opposition to Jesus. And in a certain way, as you'll recall, when we were looking particularly from the point of the entrance of Jesus into Galilee in chapter 4 through to the end of chapter 10, that the evangelist has presented to us in the way he's assembled the materials in this part of the gospel that we noted Matthew particularly invests in organizing it. He's presented Jesus as the great teacher we saw in the Sermon on the Mount, and the great healer in chapters 8 and 9, and then all of that channeled into the mission discourse of chapter 10, so that the disciples of Jesus, the ones called and commissioned, are to carry on the mission of Jesus. And we noted that that's true of a lot of parts of the gospel. We're sort of working on two levels. On one level, we're sort of back there with Jesus and his disciples as he instructs them. On another level, we're reading this in like a contemporary mode. It's an instruction for the community, for the post-Easter community. And so with that great expanse of Matthew's portrayal of Jesus and his mission before us, we turn now to a new phase, beginning with chapter 11, where opposition begins to be more virulent against Jesus. We already had snatches of it in some of the healing stories. We're reminded, as we'll be reminded again, that as Jesus began his mission in Galilee, there's this ominous reference that John the Baptist had been handed over. So there's like a bell tolling in the background of the narrative, sort of projecting the fate of Jesus himself, as we'll see. And so we move into a section where Matthew eventually will get locked right in to the narrative sequence of Mark, his primary source. Prior to this, we saw that he sort of reorganized things using a lot of Markan material, but not following the sequence in Mark. But now, Matthew, once we get beyond chapters 11 and 12, particularly chapter 11, he'll be settling in pretty much to the narrative sequence of Mark, but all along the way, adding materials and nuancing the text of Mark. And also, Matthew draws on his Q source, as we call it, the Quelle, this collection of the sayings of Jesus, sayings and parables. We'll see it especially next week when we look at the parable chapter, how Matthew weaves in these materials into creating really a new story in a way, a story still absorbing Mark, but a new story on Matthew's part. This section of the gospel that we're looking at tonight, chapters 11 and 12, and then leaping a little bit ahead to chapter 23 because we're on the motif of opposition, that is sort of a series of shifting scenes, and Matthew sort of ties them together, as we'll see, with little adverbial phrases, then or at that time, at that hour, but the sequence is not intrinsic. It's sort of connecting a series of vignettes, if you like, that form a whole, but they're not a smoothly narrative coherence to them. Just to say by preface that this idea in the Gospels, which occurs in all of the Gospels, of very early on, opposition to Jesus developing. At times, very strong, bitter opposition to him from the religious leaders. What's going on here is a connection between the mission of Jesus and his death. So that the cross, and we had talked a little bit about this before, the Passion story does not come as like a deus ex machina, something descending from the rafters, totally unexpected and unanticipated, unprepared for. No, the Gospels make the point that the death of Jesus is, in effect, the outcome of a whole series of stances, of confrontations, of commitments that ultimately give meaning to his death. This is something very important in current theology, particularly trying to understand atonement theology. We'll talk about that when we get to the Passion story. Often there's a certain kind of theology of the cross that has a very traditional roots to it, that understands Jesus' death as something somewhat arbitrary, that God sent him to die to atone for sin, to appease God's anger, to restore God's honor. It's called penal substitution. Jesus substitutes for the effects, the damage of sin that humanity had. And so the death of Jesus in this setting is not really related to the intentionality of Jesus' ministry prior to the Passion story. But the Gospels really move in a different way. Jesus goes to the cross because of the way he lived. And that is a very important connection made in the body of the Gospel. And in Matthew, it certainly comes to the fore in the section we're about to look at. You get a sense that the Gospel narrative for Matthew sort of reboots, It starts over. We have John the Baptist coming back on the scene. In this first segment I put in your notes, the reappearance of John the Baptist, which comes with the beginning of chapter 11. In 11:1, we have that typical concluding formula that comes at the end of all of Matthew's discourses, sort of connecting it to what's going on when Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples. He went on from there to teach and proclaim his message in their cities. And here, John the Baptist is reintroduced. We saw him at the baptism of Jesus, at the very initial appearance of the public ministry of Jesus, the adult Jesus coming from Galilee to be baptized in the Jordan. We saw a reference to him in chapter 4, verse 17, the beginning of the public ministry of Jesus in Galilee, when he enters into Galilee after John had been handed over. And in chapter 14, right after the section we're looking at, John the Baptist is in prison and is executed. And Jesus withdraws when he hears the news of John's execution. And all of this, John is like he's in the forefront. He's the forerunner, literally, in the gospel of various phases of Jesus' ministry and mission. And we already saw that in chapter 3, John had spoken of Jesus, of the one who is coming after me, who is stronger than me. And here he poses the question, and there's really, sort of a disconnect here that people note, that as if John had never met Jesus. I don't think this bothers Matthew. He just, is just giving a series of vignettes, as I say. It's not like an internal story that a novelist is telling that's, sort of picks up the threads of the narrative before, as I was saying before, something like that. No, it's a series of portrayals that cumulatively make their point. And so he asks what the Messiah, what the Christ was doing. When he heard what the Christ was doing, he sent word by his disciples and said, "Are you the one who is to come, or do we wait for another?" And here Jesus, as Matthew presents it, is the opportunity to sort of recapitulate what we had observed in the preceding chapters. Go and tell John what you hear and what you see. So what you hear, the preaching of Jesus and the sermon, what you see, the acts of Jesus. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have the good news brought to them. So the works of the Messiah, the works of the Christ are summarized by Jesus. This is his credentials, if you like, being presented here to John. And John's prophetic role will be asserted in the next segment here, 7 and following. We hear about John contrasted with the people with soft garments who live as kings, and there's these little remarks in the gospel, in Matthew's gospel in particular, of critique of the elite, of the people who are. John the Baptist is not one of those. What did you go out to see? Look, those who wear soft robes are in royal palaces. What did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. Because of John's role as the precursor to Jesus, as the one preparing the path, he is the last and the greatest of the prophets in the view of Matthew's gospel. And even as the last and the greatest of the prophets, and he quotes there the text that's also used in Mark's gospel, sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way before you, that was mentioned at the very beginning of the introduction of John. Those born of woman, no one has arisen greater than John the Baptist, yet the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. So Matthew poises John on the very brink of the inbreaking of the kingdom of God. So John recapitulates all of this stream of proclamation, of Spirit-inspired preparation. I have not come to destroy the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. But Jesus is something else. Jesus is the one who is to come. Jesus is the Christ. And anyone who is in sort of the era of Jesus stands in a more magnificent place than John the Baptist himself. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John came, and if you're willing to accept it, he is Elijah who is to come. We'll hear more about Elijah in Matthew's gospel, and he certainly identifies John the Baptist with Elijah. We'll see it after the transfiguration, and there's a couple of other references. It's interesting. Let anyone with ears to hear, let them hear. So this first, the reintroduction of John sort of rewinds the tape for us and reviews who Jesus is in comparison to the preceding generations and what are the actions that identify him as the one who is to come, the Messiah. And then you move, as I say, it's like, put the next slide on, he begins with tota. There's a then, if you look in verse, it's actually the, I'm sorry, I'm ahead of myself. There's not so much of a transition. In verse 16, we move into another slide, but there's not the time indication that comes in the next two segments. What will I compare this generation? This text here, Matthew 11, 16 to 18, I have come to feel is one of the most important summaries of the mission of Jesus in the New Testament, in the gospel literature, certainly. And it's placed, it's the words of Jesus, and I think the very flavor of it, the strong, sort of ironic, prophetic, almost humor that's tied into this, sort of a sardonic way, is very much like many of the sayings of Jesus. And he's playing back to his opponents their warped yet fundamentally true description of him. Okay, So he speaks, like in verse 16, what do I compare this generation? Frequently in Matthew, this generation, sometimes it refers to the disciples when they're errant, like the inability to heal the son of the father that comes up later. But mostly it refers to Jesus' opponents, the religious leaders, this generation, this particular group. And it's like children sitting in the marketplace and shouting out, literally calling out to one another. It's kids playing in the marketplace. It's sort of a quaint. And we played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We wailed, and you did not mourn. And this, we don't know if this is a snatch of a folk song or, it seems to have a certain kind of proverbial ring to it, but we don't know its origin beyond this. And then, but here's the point. For John came neither eating or drinking, and they say he has a demon. So John was introduced in chapter 3. The camel hair, the locusts and wild honey, the Elijah, the severe ascetical prophet calling for reform, the desert. So he comes in that manner. And they say he's neither eating or drinking. They say he has a demon. He's insane. Later, they'll say the same about Jesus. He has Beelzebul. He's not insane, but he's demonic. Okay? And the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners, literally anomia, those outside the law. And what struck me about this, when you think about this text, there's like a twofold reference. One is to eating and drinking, a wine bibber and a glutton. And I think as what we're going to encounter as we go forward now in the next few chapters, the meals, the multiplication of the loaves, the gathering of people at the meal of the Passover meal. And so that is certainly presented when you see the multiplication stories, the redaction that Matthew does. It's already present, but it's in Mark, but it's highlighted. This is the gathering. This is the gathering of Israel with the quail. This is it's in the wilderness. This is the gathering of the community in the Eucharist, the breaking of bread, the blessing. This is the gathering in the Passover meal. So there's a kind of dynamic of drawing in, of bringing the community together. And then there is this other dynamic, a friend of tax collectors and those outside the law. So there's an outreach, this rapport with the people on the perimeter that is very typical of the gospel. The association with the least, which is Matthew's particular formulation of that. And so there's both the outreach and there's the pulling together in community. So mission and community in this text. And it ends with a very significant reference. Yet wisdom is vindicated by her deeds. Now, a couple things to note. One is the reference to deeds here again. So we're being brought back the erga, the works of the Messiah that John the Baptist had asked about when he saw what the Christ was doing. He went to ask, and Jesus reviews the actions. So the wisdom here, the works of wisdom, Matthew is identifying Jesus with wisdom, that wisdom will be vindicated by her actions. And this is a great interest in Matthean studies that Matthew here, and we'll see in this further in chapter 11, the reference to my burden is light and come and be refreshed. This is wisdom language. This is, wisdom, for example, in Proverbs chapter 8, this is a beautiful concept in Judaism. And John's gospel uses wisdom categories very strongly. Wisdom, as you recall, in Jewish tradition, wisdom becomes a kind of metaphorical device that refers, it sort of personifies the presence of God in history. Okay? Wisdom is like the image of God that comes into the human realm and takes a place in the human realm. There's wisdom spoken of in the sense of being sage and wise and thoughtful. But wisdom used in this sort of revelatory context is a way in Judaism of speaking about God. For example, in chapter 8 of Proverbs, this is a text that is very beloved in Judaism because they will identify wisdom with Torah. That the Torah is, in fact, the embodiment of wisdom, that the Torah becomes like God's presence. Let me just read this passage. It's 8:22. The Lord created me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of long ago. This is wisdom speaking. Okay? So wisdom was created first. Ages ago I was set up at the first before the beginning of the earth. When there was no depths, I was brought forth, when there were no springs abounding with water. Before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills, I was brought forth. When he had not yet made earth and fields, or the world's first bits of soil. When he established the heavens, I was there. Okay. What's beautiful in Judaism, they, by identifying wisdom with Torah, they say, God had the Torah there when he created the world. Okay? So the Torah was the blueprint. Okay? And so when you search nature, the world that God created, you will discover the Torah. Paul, thinks this way in the first chapter of Romans. Remember, he says, people, if they looked at nature that God made, they would find God. And Judaism says they would have found the law. And Paul is sort of implying this because he wants to say at the opening part of Romans, look, the Jews failed to be faithful to the law. And the Gentiles failed because their minds were clouded and they couldn't find God in nature. Okay? So everybody sinned. Okay? Everybody's in bad shape is what Paul wants to start with that happy message. But he's using these same formulations. It goes on about this. I was with him. I was beside him like a master worker. He was acting on God's behalf. I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world and delighting in the human race. And it goes on, as typical at the end of chapter 8. We'll see this in Sirach that has an influence later in Matthew chapter 11. It's about, listen to me, happy are those who keep my ways. Hear instructions and be wise. Happy is the one who listens to me, watching daily at my gates. Whoever finds me finds life and obtains favor from the Lord. But those who miss me injure themselves. All who hate me love death. Okay? So you can see how easy to slip into Torah this is for the Jewish interpretation. But it's the idea, it's God's presence being spoken of in a euphemistic way in terms of wisdom. So here, Matthew, coming back to our text, sees Jesus. And we're going to see the next segment, this so-called Johannine meteor that flashes across the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus is the revealer of God's tenderness and God's mercy to the world. So this segment, 11, 16 to 19, is a quaint way and a beautiful way of summarizing the mission of Jesus, both as rebuilding the people and reaching out to the alienated, and that is the works of wisdom. This is what God's presence is intending. This Emmanuel, God with us, the name that Jesus bears in this gospel. We move next, it's like, as I say, change the slide, and he has here, it's like tota, I think I have a vivid memory back in graduate school being asked to do a study of the use of tota in Matthew. It was very exciting, believe me. There's some 90 uses of this conjunction in Matthew, but he uses it a lot as like, then or now. It's a transition type of word. So then he began to reproach the cities, and here, we've had the emphasis on the manifestation of Jesus. Through John's questions, Jesus responds. We've had Jesus respond to the hostility of his opponents by summarizing his mission as the wine bibber and the glutton, the lover of tax collectors, and so on. And now it comes back to this judgment motif that is a very frequent refrain in Matthew. The emphasis, in this gospel on the responsibility of following God's will, the importance of deeds and not words, the call to action that is so constant in Matthew's gospel. The flip side of that is the consequences of inaction, the consequences of not responding, not repenting. And here we have it, and it connects to the deeds of power that we just had reviewed. He began to reproach the cities in which most of his deeds of power had been done because he did not repent. And what we have here is a series of towns that are all right together in this northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee. If you've been there or will there, is on your bucket list. There's Capharnaum, and there's Chorazim, and there's Bethsaida. They're right, within walking distance. And so those are the insider towns. They're the ones that where much of the Galilean ministry of Jesus has been concentrated. So woe to them if the deeds of power done in you have been done in Tyre and Sidon, for example, across the boundary in Lebanon. And we'll hear about the woman in chapter 15 who is from there, who comes out and responds to Jesus, the Canaanite woman. They would have repented long ago, and the day of judgment will be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon than for you. And you, Capharnaum, the home base of Jesus in the Gospels, will you be exalted to heaven? No, you will be brought down to Hades. For if the deeds of power done in you have been done in Sodom, okay, this is worse than Tyre and Sidon, This is as far as we go. We're not in Kansas anymore. It would have remained until this day. I tell you that on the day of judgment it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom than for you. And what we have here, as I put on the notes, it's like this insider-outsider dynamic that is so much part of this gospel. The religious leaders are the insiders personified, and they fail to respond to Jesus. The people on the perimeter, the tax collectors and the sinners, the sick, they respond to Jesus. And here, these towns that are the focus of Jesus' presence don't respond as they should, and they would be outdone by Tyre and Sidon and Sodom. And I put there, is this a hint of the mission to come? That the people who respond will be beyond the perimeter, whereas many of the leaders within Israel will not respond to Jesus. So this comes, it may seem like out of place, but when you think of the pattern of Matthew's gospel, when he talks about what Jesus says and does and the call to respond, there's always this kicker in there about judgment. If you fail to respond, the consequences for your life are significant. And here then we move into what is one of the most famous passages of Matthew's gospel, as you know. This is this chapter 11, 25 to 26, and then, 27, and then 28 and 29 to 30. they're sort of bound together, but there's a couple of different moods here. And again, he links it up with the phrase, at that time, Jesus said. And here you have, this is what people have called the Johannine meteor that seems to streak across the Matthean skies, but uses the kind of language that we're familiar with in John's Gospel. But it also, really fits into Matthew's Gospel. And it's very unctuous, I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and the intelligent and have revealed them to infants. And here it is again, the wise and the intelligent, the leaders, the insiders, the people most proximate fail to grasp it. But the children, the outsiders, the ones nobody expects anything, they respond. And here you come to sort of a summit statement of Matthew's Christology. All things have been handed over to me by my Father. And no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. So here you sense, that we had talked about the title Son of God earlier that we saw at the baptism. There's a traditional meaning to that title within Judaism, the royal title, you are my son, this day I've begotten you, the enthronement Psalms, the king called the Son of God. But in Matthew, as you have in Mark, like the Abba reference, in Paul and Romans, Abba, this sense of the intimacy of Jesus with God, with his Father, moves to another level. Hengel, in that book I had referred you to, Son of God, points to this text as particularly significant, that what's being disclosed here is a conviction about the person of Jesus that is intimately bound with God. And he's God with us, as Matthew has said. He is God's wisdom. He is the revealer. Something very, substantially affirmed in Johannine Christology. Jesus has made him known. The Word becomes flesh and has exegeted God, as it says in 1:18. But it's also here in Matthew's text. So this is a, very key affirmation. And Matthew is affirming it in the midst of strong opposition to Jesus. We have the same thing in the Transfiguration. As you're moving towards the Passion, there's this disclosure of the identity of Jesus. Listen to him. It's this kind of manifestation, a light breaking through for the reader of the Gospel as it's breaking through for the disciple witnesses here. And then you have verse 28 and following, and here again is a wisdom motif coming back. Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens. I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. You will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Now, one of the things we'll be looking at in a couple of minutes at chapter 23, the woes against the scribes and the Pharisees. And one of the indictments against them is that they lay heavy burdens on others and don't lift a finger. It's the crushing of the human spirit, the bending of the bruised reed. And so here, the yoke of Jesus is seen as refreshing, as gentle, as compassionate. And here is where wisdom motifs also are very strong. Reference is made to Sirach, chapter 51, verses 23 to 30. And just listen to this. It's at the very end of Sirach, which uses a lot of the same kind of wisdom language that we saw in Proverbs. But it ends with a kind of an appeal, an exhortation. Draw near to me, you who are uneducated, and lodge in the house of instruction. Why do you say you are lacking in these things, and why do you endure such great thirst? I opened my mouth, again, this is wisdom speaking, okay, and said, acquire wisdom for yourselves without money. Put your neck under her yoke. Let your souls receive instruction. It is to be found close by. See with your own eyes that I have labored but little and found for myself much serenity. Hear but a little of my instruction, and through me you will acquire silver and gold. May your soul rejoice in God's mercy, and may you never be ashamed to praise him. Do your work in good time, and in his own time God will give you your reward. So it's just like this kind of gentleness, God appealing to take on the yoke. There's many passages like this in the wisdom literature, sort of an affectionate, reassuring, serene way of calling people to respond to the Torah, to respond to wisdom. And so I think in the context of Matthew's gospel, what we're looking at, and it's something to ponder, I think, his interpretation of law, as we'll see in chapter 12 that follows, like the plucking of grain on the Sabbath or the healing of the man with the withered arm. Matthew sees Jesus interpreting the law. It's mercy I desire, not sacrifice. That text from Hosea 6, chapter 6. He interprets it in terms of compassion. At the same time, in the Sermon on the Mount, we saw that Jesus' interpretation of the law, in contrast to the sort of received interpretation, demands more intense fidelity. It's not just do not kill, but do not harbor hatred in your heart. It's not just, don't take an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, but don't respond in a violent way at all. Love your enemies. We know these texts. And for Matthew, I think part of the sense is that this fulfills the human yearning. This is what Ulrich Lutz, a great interpreter of Matthew's gospel, says that what's going on in the Sermon on the Mount is not like a kind of sense of sort of trials that you have to go through to prove that your moral superiority. It's not arbitrary imposition of, more burdens, but it's being presented as reflecting the true nature of the human person. That in living in this way, you are released, you are free, you become truly who you are. This is what he says, it's disclosing our true nature. And so that in responding in the manner of these illustrations in the sermon, it's not to take on a rigor, but it's to acquire a freedom that is actually refreshing, and it's not hypocritical, it's true, it's authentic. I think this is very important for understanding how Matthew presents the teaching of Jesus. So you have here this very important passage in chapter 11, both the recapitulation of Jesus' ministry in those particular terms we looked at about the children in the marketplace, and in this text, 11:25 and following, the intimacy of Jesus, the unique revealer of God. And what he reveals is compassion, a burden that is light and refreshing. You're really deep into the heart of Matthew's perspective here, I think. What follows in chapter 12, as I put there, is a series of conflicts. And this is drawn mainly from what we encounter in Mark's Gospel in chapter 2, verse 1 to chapter 3, verse 6. In Mark, if you recall, the first chapter of Mark, from 1:14 on, when Jesus enters into Galilee, is this series of healings and exorcisms, almost frenetic in its intensity. the man in the synagogue of Capharnaum, Simon's mother-in-law, the crowds that come, the leper who comes at the climactic point of this. And so Mark 2 starts the gospel with this display of Jesus' healing power. And then after the healing of the leper, you move to chapter 2 in Mark, and it's like he comes back home again, but now there's a series of conflicts with the opponents of Jesus that ends in chapter 3, verse 6 of Mark, with the leaders, the Pharisees and the Herodians, determined to kill Jesus. They begin a plot to kill Jesus. So the conflicts that Matthew is drawing on from Mark follows a pattern. But what's happened in Matthew's gospel, again, from the parallel to Mark in chapter 1, all these healings, Matthew has inserted this big long section, chapters 5 through 10, that we've been looking at. But now he's back to the Markan sequence and picks up the story again. He used Mark's stuff in that big swatch of material, chapters 5 to 10, but the order was different. What's interesting here, and I put them, we won't go into a lot of details, is to set for yourself the two Gospels and look at the versions of these stories. You really see, typical patterns of Matthew, in a sense, rereading Mark's text. We saw that already in chapters 8 and 9 with the miracle stories, that Matthew reduces them, he squeezes out some of the more colorful details, he focuses on the actions of Jesus, and that is happening here. In the first story, the disciples eating grain on the Sabbath and the protests of the Pharisees. What Matthew adds there that's very significant is in verse 7 of chapter 12. He adds the text, "It's mercy I desire and not sacrifice." He adds the quotation from Hosea, chapter 6, verse 6. And this has already been cited in defending his association with Levi in his eating with his friends. So it's an important text for Matthew and summarizes the fact of how he interprets it. You have the man with the withered hand. Again, Matthew leaves out some of the little salient details where, like, Jesus knows that in their hearts, their hearts are hardened, and he becomes angry with them. Matthew just sort of cuts to the chase and tells the man, "Get up and stretch out your arm." The cure of the blind and mute demoniac in Mark chapter 3, this is wrapped around the appearance of Jesus' family, if you remember. The family come to bring Jesus home in chapter 3, verse 21. And then you have the leaders say it's by Beelzebul that he casts out. And then the family shows up at the house, and they're standing outside, and they want to take Jesus home in Mark. Matthew changes all of that. He eliminates that reference to the family wanting to seize Jesus. Note too, I don't know how much you're thrilled by these little details or not, but it just shows you the kind of freedom and variance of the tradition. Take a look at this one in chapter 12, 38 to 45, the sign of Jonah. In Matthew's version of this Jonah story, the point is that Jonah was in the belly of the whale 3 days and 3 nights. So the sign of Jonah is going to be Jesus' death and resurrection. Okay? But in Luke's gospel, the sign of Jonah is the fact that he preached to the Ninevites and they repented. Okay? So we all know the Jonah story, and Luke likes the impact of Jonah's preaching on the Ninevites. He doesn't say anything about him being in the belly of the whale. And so that's the point. That's the sign of Jonah. In Mark, there's a sign but no Jonah. Okay, in Mark's version of this, they ask for a sign. He rejects this generation asks for a sign, there'll be no sign given them, but there's no reference to Jonah at all in the parallel. So, three different ways of doing this. The other couple of things just to note again, sort of roaring through this segment here, the doing the will of God. Look in chapter 12, 33 to 37. This is so, typical of Matthew. Either make the tree good and its fruit good, or make the tree bad and its fruit bad, for the tree is known by its fruits. This was said at the end of chapter 7, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, the same thing. Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And this will be taken up in chapter 15 about foods. It's not what you take in that makes you impure. It's what comes out of the heart that makes you impure. So you have to give an account for every careless word you utter. This is very typical in the Sermon on the Mount, again, about oaths and about cursing and so on. So, these are characteristic moral language of Matthew. And we'll see it all comes together in chapter 23, the sort of the indictments that are raised against the leaders, these hypocrisy and so on that's typical of this. We end with this section in chapter 12 with the true family of Jesus, 46 to 50. As I mentioned, this is a story in Mark that's prepared for it. Mark associates the family of Jesus with the opponents of Jesus in the sense that they don't understand Jesus. They want to stop his mission. They think he is insane, Mark has them say, and they come to take him home. Okay? In Matthew, you don't have that harshness about the family of Jesus. And Luke completely changes it all around. Where the family is defined and his mother is defined as the one who hears the word of God and keeps it. But here, Matthew has retained this focus, and we had talked about this earlier, the fact that blood ties, the moving away from blood ties, the moving away from the familial image for the community in the New Testament, in the gospel literature, was extremely important for them. If it was all based on blood ties, the Gentiles could never get in. If it was all based on blood ties, you would have had a intrinsic patriarchal structure to the community. And we'll see that Matthew is very, when we look at chapter 18 and a segment in chapter 23, is very much opposed to that. So it's a community of disciples. There's one teacher, there's one father, there's one head of all. All the rest are on equal footing. And so here you have that same thing. Look, your mother and your brothers are standing outside wanting to speak to you. But to the one who told him this, Jesus replied, "Who is my mother and who are my brethren?" And pointing to his disciples, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." Okay. So the connection with Jesus, if you like, the family of Jesus, is based on discipleship ties, not blood ties. And that, is certainly the reconstitution here of the community, the assembly, the kahal. That is the whole mission of Jesus. Let's take a quick look, if you would, to skipping ahead to chapter 23, which is down the line, I know, but I just thought it would fit here when we're talking about opposition. This is one of the most notorious, I guess, passages you would say in Matthew about the indictment of the leaders. And as I put there on your notes, there's sort of a threefold division or structure of this. And the first 12 verses are an indictment of the leaders. But notice, as you're aware, in the verse 2, this paradoxical affirmation of the authority of the scribes and the Pharisees. The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore, do whatever they teach you and follow it, but do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they teach. Okay. So, on the one hand, Matthew still is encouraging his community to have respect for the authority of the leaders of the community, the Jewish community, not Jewish, I shouldn't say, because he's in a Jewish community too, but of the opposition community or the dominant group from which they're feeling some alienation. But they sit on Moses' seat. You know, in each of the synagogues there's the seat of Moses. And, you know, as I'm sure many of you, but I've been in some very small little synagogues in the Middle East, and they have a plastic chair there, you know, strapped to the wall. That's the seat of Moses. That's the sign of authority. Or you have Bernini's, chair behind the great altar of St. Peter's. But it's the same idea that the rabbi sits to teach. This is the symbol of the authority of Moses, the continuity of the tradition. So Matthew references that and says, respect them, you know. And do what they teach when they're teaching the law, but it's their example that's, discordant. And it's not just their example, it's this thing we just saw in 11:25 and so on. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and they lay them on the shoulders of others, but they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them. So this lack of empathy, of compassion, hypocrisy, but also, an abuse of religious authority. And this notion, all of this was in, as people say, this is sort of the negative Sermon on the Mount, you know. And in Luke, you have the woes included in the Sermon on the Plain. But Matthew has sort of sorted them out into this discourse. And he says, they do all their deeds to be seen by others. They make their phylacteries broad, their fringes long. And remember, this is not mocking the phylacteries or the fringes. We hear in the story of the woman with the hemorrhage, Jesus has fringes. She touches his tassels, you know. So it's not that practice, it's the hypocrisy that these are a show. It doesn't reflect what's on the inside. They love to have places of honor at banquets and best seats in the synagogues, to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, to have people call them rabbi. And you are not to be called rabbi. You have one teacher. You are all students. Here's this famous segment here of this sort of the egalitarian vision of the community. Egalitarian in the sense that there is only one person with the absolute authority in the community. You are all disciples, literally says Mathetai. And call no one your father on earth. You have one Father, the one in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors. This word is sort of an ambiguous word. Some would say leaders, some say teachers. For you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant. You know, one of the things to note in this text, that the entry point, if you look in Mark's Gospel, in chapter 12, right before the discussion, the apocalyptic discourse of chapter 13, the place where Matthew inserts this denunciation is it's at a very gripping section at the end of chapter 12 of Mark's text. In 12:38, as he taught, he said, beware of the scribes, this is Mark, who like to walk around in long robes, to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. It's there that Matthew inserts this discourse. He does not have the story about the widow, that follows here at the end of chapter 12 in Mark. But that denunciation in Mark's text, Jesus' denunciation in the setting of the Jerusalem temple and the hypocrisy and this very strong, they devour the the houses of widows, is where Matthew expands this into this denunciation that we saw. And the next segment, 13 to 36, these are the woes. And it repeats so much of what we saw in the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 6. It's what we see in chapter 15, the text about the tradition of the elders. It's placing obstacles again. And we'll see this in chapter 18. Putting a scandalon, obstacles in the way of the least, of the little ones, the mikroi, this sense in Matthew of the failure of being sensitive to the people who are struggling, to the vulnerable. This reaching out to the vulnerable is so emphatic in Matthew. And here's the flip side of it, these woes that you hypocrites, you lock people out of the kingdom of heaven, for you do not go in yourselves. When others are going in, you stop them. This obstacles. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, you cross the sea and land to make a single convert, and you make the new convert twice as much a child of hell as yourselves. It's pretty tough stuff. This, by the way, has led to all kinds of discussion of to what degree did Judaism in this period do proselytizing. There's very ambiguous evidence that, you have Christian missionary activity. Did you have Jewish missionary activity? You certainly have an openness in Judaism in the first century to Gentile proselytes coming into the community. But was there going out to recruit them? Or was it because they were enamored of Judaism as an ancient religion and for its ethic and the beauty of its tradition? You had the God-fearers who were associated with the synagogues all throughout the Asia Minor and Rome and so on. But this idea of going across the sea to make converts, you have a debate whether that, at some stage, whether this was going on. And the evidence is slim for it. And then you have the question of oaths. We saw this already in chapter 5. Do not take oaths. We'll see Peter, as we had talked about last time, about Peter swearing that he doesn't know Jesus and swearing with an oath in the Passion story. There's something in Matthew about your speeches should be yes, yes, and no, no. The taking of oaths is toxic. And I've often wondered, how does the church get away with requiring oaths, of allegiance and so on? Maybe they haven't read Matthew's gospel, who knows? And then look at verse 23. I think this is very indicative also of the mentality that Jesus in Matthew's gospel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, you tithe the mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and good faith. It is these you ought to practice without neglecting the others. And, taking tithe, you were not obliged to take tithing on spices. So mint and dill and cumin was not a requirement. That was not included in your tithing. But people would do it as an act of devotion. Okay, it's going the extra mile. So what's interesting, Jesus cites this, but not to mock it. He says you ought to have done it, but don't neglect the weightier matters. There's things more important than taking tithe on mint and dill and cumin. That's the sense you have of Matthew's whole interpretation of the law. The love command, on this command, all of the law and the prophets hang. This text in chapter 21. So here they're being critiqued not for their devotion, but for their lack of what would you say, of clarity, of priorities about what is important, and their failure to understand that love and mercy and compassion is the heart of the law. And then you have, again, the hypocrisy, 27 and 28. You're beautiful on the outside, but inside full of the bones of the dead and all kinds of filth. You look righteous to others, but inside full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. The accusation of them about, the killers of the prophets. You said we would not have persecuted the prophet, but you now fill up the measure of your ancestors. People note, by the way, that this reference to the tombs of the prophets in the Kidron Valley, right below the Temple Mount currently, there are these first and second century BC monumental tombs built during the Hasmonean period that were popularly associated with as tombs for the prophets. They were not tombs for the prophets, they were tombs of royal families, but in the popular mentality of the first century, they assumed they were tombs for the prophets. So this is a citation. People point out that Jesus was referring to a building that's still standing in the Kidron Valley. That's a footnote you can, put for your Trivial Pursuits game the next time. The thing I want to end with, you see here, I send you prophets, sages, and scribes. And this notion of sages and scribes, particularly, we know that Matthew excoriates the scribes and the Pharisees of the opposition, if you like. But it's also likely that in Matthew's community, there were people who were scribes. That the scribe trained for the kingdom of heaven, as we'll see at the end of the parable discourse. And this text, I will send you prophets and scribes. And this would be the literate, learned, thoughtful people who knew the law, people who served as interpreting the law. But these are scribes of the Christian community, the Jewish Christian community of which Matthew is a part. And they are going to be flogged and persecuted and so on, as we saw already this morning in chapter 10. I'd just like to, I know we're a little over time, just look at the last segment here, 37 to 39. This is like the final epitaph that Matthean Jesus speaks here with his opponents. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to you. How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. You would not, literally. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. And, people wrestle with this passage. On the one hand, it seems to be a kind of prediction of the destruction of Jerusalem. We'll be taking that up also in the Passion story of Matthew. And chapter 24 and 25, the gospel seems to be conscious of what happens to Jerusalem. It's being written after the destruction of Jerusalem, even though the story is about events before that, the life of Jesus. But here, your house will be left desolate. But what is the meaning of verse 39? Does the Matthean Jesus, is Israel abandoned? Is Jerusalem abandoned? Or does the saying of Jesus in the mind of Matthew, until, you say, until you will not see me again until you say, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. I think of Paul's wrestling with this in Romans 9 to 11, and promises are irrevocable. The story of Israel is the final story. The whole destiny of humanity will ultimately come to its conclusion when Israel is involved. So I think that this, the destiny of Israel is here, even in this poignant, sharply critical moment that Matthew includes here. I put there at the end of your notes, just to bring this to an end, and thank you for your patience. There is opposition. There was opposition to Jesus. I mentioned earlier the book of Horsley, that Jesus' mission of teaching and healing was directed to a very difficult situation where the villages and the peoples, particularly in the Galilee region, had been brutalized through the kings of the Romans and economically crushed, and at times inflicted with violence, with physical violence. So the mission of Jesus was, in a sense, the Herodians. We have in Luke, they want to kill him, Antipas is looking for him to kill him. And the Pharisees even warned Jesus about it. So he had that, and then he has in Jerusalem the situation where there's direct Roman rule, but the public order is in the hands of an elite, the priests and the elders, not the ordinary country priests like Zachary, in Luke's text, but the leading ones who had a lot at stake to maintain order. And Jesus is very provocative, as the story will end, coming into Jerusalem, as already has happened when we're coming to chapter 23. So there was opposition to Jesus, and it is not improbable that it would be deadly opposition to him for the sake of public order and for the sake of the threat of Roman intervention. And then you have, the fuller context. We're also aware that there's another layer here, that at the time the gospel's being composed, there are also sharp tensions between the Jewish Christian community and the majority Jewish community, because both of them are in a critical period of trying to shape their own identity, what's called formative Judaism, in the wake of the destruction of the temple. So each is trying to find its way, and each is in tension with each other, which adds a sense of bitterness like we have here. You travel the seas to make a convert and make them a child of hell, worse than yourselves. And the later interpretation of Matthew, when we get beyond this period of the first century, and you get into the patristic period, and you get into the post-Constantinian period, where Christianity is in the ascendancy, you have this rhetoric becomes ideological anti-Semitism. And it's an embarrassment to read the text of the great teachers and saints of the patristic period to see what they say about the Jews, John Chrysostom and so on. It's really rough stuff to read. And so I just refer you there to the Pontifical Biblical Commission statement, the Jewish people and their sacred scriptures in the Christian Bible, which was John Paul II commissioned that and gave final approval to it. And Cardinal Ratzinger was the head of the commission that formulated this, so it has a lot of high-class endorsement, but it's very strong on just confronting this. It's a very rich text, so this is an issue I think that we have a certain responsibility to, and I'd advise you to read, just at least read some of the parts of it. I put some pages, or the paragraph numbers that are very pertinent to what we're talking about. So thank you all. I'm sorry to have gone a little longer, but safe home, everybody, and we'll see you next week.